When you're down and out, a helping hand can seem like a dream come true.
He offered her love and comfort in her time of need.
He's willing to love her, her children, and help her escape that life of poverty.
But what if that love comes at a price?
There was tension and volatility between them in the past.
He's screaming, I'll kill you, this thing.
How far would you be willing to go to protect it?
There were 15 different points of impact on his skull.
They didn't have to do anything this drastic.
She would do anything to keep her relationship in a place where she felt protected.
We could have died tonight, and I'm the one with the finger pointed at.
April 26, 2014, Akron, Ohio. Just 45 minutes from Cleveland, Akron is known as the rubber capital of the world.
We used to have the biggest rubber companies here, and also it's where they make the blimp.
It has a prominent university, the University of Akron. There's some really good restaurants and entertainment in the area. A bit of a smaller town if you like that feel.
It is a good-sized city, Midwestern Rust Belt. We have a lot to offer. A lot of good things happen, but we have crime just like any other city.
On this cool spring evening, the Akron Police Department receives an alarming call.
The call came in at 10:15 p.m., and this was on Monona Avenue in Akron. What we knew at the time was that there was a fight.
The caller, Tiffany Powell, says the confrontation escalated quickly.
Tiffany Powell told the call taker that her ex-boyfriend came over and was currently fighting with her current boyfriend, and that there was a gun involved.
Tiffany said her ex-boyfriend showed up at the house not long before the confrontation began.
The last bit of information we got before we arrived was that Tiffany and her current boyfriend were now hiding in the garage.
Officers arrive within minutes.
As we pull up to the house, there is a van in the driveway. We approach the van. We see a male in the driver's seat. And in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, this is possibly the ex-boyfriend who arrived at the house. And is he now about to leave?
The man says his name is Michael, and they ask him why he's there.
What he told us was that his dad wanted to come look at a car that was for sale. And so he brought his dad over to look at a car. He said that this woman took his father around the back of the house. And that's pretty much all he knew. We asked him how long he had been sitting there. He said about 20 minutes before we arrived.
Officers then turn their attention to the house.
These other officers went to the back of the house, made entry.
They enter and find a man standing at the base of a flight of stairs that leads to the basement. He has his hands up and he's yelling, "He's down here."
Officers enter the basement and find 69-year-old James Harris lying motionless on the floor. Originally from Alabama, James Harris joined the Marines at an early age. After being honorably discharged, he moved to Canton, Ohio, just south of Akron.
James was a lover of God and also of education.
He got married in 1968 and then went to the University of Akron and studied to be a teacher.
James Harris taught special ed for about 30 years.
During that time, He and his wife had 5 children together.
He was a person that loved his family and loved his community.
After 32 years of marriage, James's wife passed away. A few years later, James met a young single mother named Tiffany Powell.
Tiffany met James when she was a teenager looking for a car.
Tiffany had a tough start in life.
She never had a father figure in her life. It was just her and her mother.
She was in a single-family home. The home itself wasn't great and didn't really have a lot of resources.
Because of her family's struggles, Tiffany longed for a sense of security.
Tiffany would look to boys for comfort. She got pregnant at 15 and dropped out of school.
Her lack of opportunities and education definitely made her more dependent on the men that came into her life.
James felt bad for Tiffany, and the two became friends over the next few years.
Tiffany ended up having another child and moving out of her mom's house. She actually lived in her car, and James helped her find a place to live. That's when the two became romantically involved.
There was a large age difference between Tiffany and James, and given her background and growing up, she probably looked to James as a father figure.
With him having been a teacher for 30 years, he had some financial stability that he offered her that she didn't have on her own.
He was a strong pillar in the community. He was very well looked up to, and he was stable. That probably attracted Tiffany as well.
For the next 10 years, James and Tiffany shared a life and had 5 children of their own together.
Tiffany adored her children, and they were the center of her world. But the relationship between she and James didn't last.
By 2012, Tiffany had met a man named Paul Reed, who worked in a nursing home, and decided to move on with her life.
She meets another man that is willing to love her, her children, and take care of her.
James decided to retire and focus on a slower-paced life.
James had a hobby of buying old cars and fixing them and selling them. So that was something that he loved to do.
But now, Akron police have found James lying on the floor in a basement.
He isn't moving, and he appears to have major trauma to his head.
The man who directed officers to the basement identifies himself as 38-year-old Paul Reed. He says that James attacked him with a gun, and he was only trying to defend himself.
Paul was breathing heavy and extremely upset. He kept saying he was going to throw up.
Paul was concerned. He kept saying, please don't let him die.
In April 2014, police in Akron, Ohio, have just discovered 69-year-old James Harris lying motionless on the basement floor after an altercation.
Paul Reed is practically standing over him, all upset, and claims that James attacked him with a gun and he had to defend himself.
Police officers call the paramedics, but when they arrive, it's too late.
James Harris was obviously deceased, so the paramedics called the medical examiner.
Officers see a small silver pistol lying on the ground. They pick up the weapon for safekeeping, and there's a round in the chamber.
Unsure what transpired, officers place Tiffany and Paul in different rooms and notify homicide detectives. Detectives enter the home, looking for clues as to what occurred.
The house on Monotto was a single-floor house. I believe it had 2 bedrooms. When I walked inside, there was no furniture except for maybe a bed in the bedroom. It may have not even been a bed. It may have just been a mattress. Basement was empty too, except for a washer and dryer that was in a separate room than where we found James.
The firearm was reportedly brought into the house by James. It was collected as evidence and sent off to the lab for testing.
They find that James's injuries are consistent with blunt force trauma.
Hair fibers and a small pool of blood on the basement floor indicate James's head likely hit the concrete floor during the fight.
While investigators continue processing the crime scene inside, James Harris's son, Michael, is still being questioned in the driveway.
He was calm, but he absolutely knew something had happened.
Police decide not to share information with Michael until they know more.
We were getting information sporadically from the other officers inside, but at that point, we had not told him specifically what was going on.
Officers bring Michael, Tiffany, and Paul down to the station.
We interviewed all three to get their side of the story, their statements, to try and figure out what exactly happened on Minota.
Police begin with Tiffany, who gives them background on her relationship with the two men, starting with James.
How long are you guys together?
Well, since I was 18 to 27.
So you were together for 9 years. And how many kids do you have together?
5.
According to Tiffany, her relationship with James was tumultuous.
Tiffany said that James abused her and some of her children over the course of their relationship. The only reason she stayed in the abusive relationship was that she could not afford to leave.
Tiffany says she sought safety in domestic violence shelters over the course of her relationship with James.
She said that she had left James Harris and she's had to hide from him, and that everywhere she goes, he seems to find her.
Once Tiffany decided to leave James, she was reduced to living in her vehicle with her children.
She says it was then that she met Paul Reed, who has been her rock ever since.
At the time that Tiffany meets Paul, she's living in her car, and Paul kind of comes in and saves the day for her.
Paul offered her love and comfort in her time of need. He's also offering to protect her.
He wanted to help her escape that life of homelessness.
According to Tiffany, James was jealous of her relationship with Paul.
He wants me to come back and be in his house and take care of the kids and that kind of thing. He says he's not going to get no kind of girlfriend or anything like that. It's always been a thing where if I don't give him what he wants, then he causes problems, like following custody for our children.
She said that she had moved to Akron to start over with her new boyfriend, Paul. She was telling us that basically her and Paul were in hiding from him so that he wouldn't find her.
I lost my kids because I kept my kids out of school because I've been running from him. And every time he finds out where I live at, he comes there.
Investigators asked Tiffany to recount what happened that night.
Tiffany told us that they weren't expecting anybody and that they heard the loud bang. And that's when James busted in the house with a gun in hand.
I can't remember exactly what he said, but Paul grabbed him and he said something about, "Get off me, man, get off me."
April 26, 2014, Akron, Ohio. Police are interviewing Tiffany Powell and her boyfriend, Paul Reed, after officers discover Tiffany's ex-boyfriend, James Harris, dead in their basement.
Tiffany told police that her ex was obsessive and was jealous of her and Paul, and that he was trying to prevent her from getting custody of her 5 kids. And then he showed up and attacked her boyfriend.
Tiffany claims that she really doesn't know what happened, but she knows that there was a fight.
After speaking with Tiffany, investigators sit down with Paul.
I couldn't tell what the emotion from him was, if he was upset that James had passed or if he was upset because James passing was going to increase the chances that he was in a lot more trouble than what he initially thought he was. But he was definitely very upset about finding out that James had passed.
Paul tells investigators the same thing Tiffany said, that he and Tiffany have been living in fear of James for some time.
Okay, basically I'm just gonna ask you, tell me about what happened tonight.
I don't even know. It was like, I don't know if he followed us home or something, because we've been running from him for a while. You know, we moved to so many different places, you know, and each time he finds us, and I'm always trying to be careful and always follow me or whatever. Tonight we were out, and
Why is it you guys are running from this guy?
he's obsessed with her. That's his ex. You know, they have kids together.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's an older guy, she's a younger girl, you know. I understand.
Investigators ask him to walk them through what happened in the basement that night.
Paul was in the basement doing laundry. He heard a loud bang. He ran up the basement stairs.
I just wanted to make sure she didn't fall or whatever. I didn't know what was going on.
And at that point, James Harris came into the house and brandished a gun. Paul stated that he and James began to tussle over the gun.
I was sitting here fighting, and I'm like, please, let go of the gun, let go of the gun, let go of the gun. And screaming and hollering. And he's screaming and hollering, I'm gonna kill you.
They tussled all the way down the basement stairs, and he couldn't get the gun away from James, so he started slamming James against the basement floor to try and disarm him.
And I'm just screaming, please put the gun down. I'm banging his head on the ground. I am. I'm trying to get anything to get the gun. And I don't know if he finally dropped it and she kicked it away, or did I knock it away? I don't really remember. I just remember seeing the gun and acting on it. That's all I can remember. I didn't even realize who it was until after, you know what I mean? I didn't even realize I was just fighting.
As to why James allegedly resorted to violence, Paul believes a recent discovery might have pushed him over the edge.
I think he just recently found out that she was pregnant, like she'd been hiding it, you know?
Right.
He must have followed us home or something, I don't know.
Could this be just a fight that went too far?
Paul was in fear of his life, and so in self-defense, he had to defend himself and ultimately ended up hitting James's head on the concrete in the basement.
But when investigators speak with James Harris's son, Michael, he shares a very different version of the night's events. Michael says that evening, his dad told him he wanted to look at a car and possibly some appliances.
He told us that he and his father had left a church function and they were on their way to view a car they were going to buy so that James could work on it and fix it up.
He said his dad had received a call from a woman earlier in the day who wanted to sell him a car and a washing machine, and he had made arrangements to go and look at them.
They weren't exactly sure where the house was. They drove down Mendota and they see a woman out in front of the house. And so they figured they were in the right area. They pulled in the driveway and the woman said, yes, the vehicle's here and I'll take you in the house. You can talk to whoever you need to talk to.
James was told he had to go in through the back door because the carpet had just been cleaned and they didn't want to walk over the carpet.
this woman took his father around the back of the house. And that's pretty much all he knew.
He told us that Tiffany was not the female that they met in the front yard that took him around the back.
Detectives then break the sad news to Michael.
Obviously, he had to be shocked. His life has changed literally in an instant, and it had to be devastating to lose his father, who he loved immensely.
Police tell Michael about Tiffany and Paul's allegations that James was armed that night.
He was very surprised because he's never known his father to ever carry a gun.
Detectives aren't sure what to make of it.
His version of the events seemed like he was being truthful.
The stories from the two different sides of this incident were miles apart.
All we know is we got a dead guy in the basement and people lying to us.
In the spring of 2014, Akron police investigating the death of James Harris have spoken to his ex-girlfriend Tiffany Powell and her boyfriend Paul Reed.
Paul and Tiffany's version of events is essentially that they were on the defense, that James had been harassing them for a period of time before this happened.
But James's son, Michael, says his dad was there to look at a car and was met there by a mysterious woman.
We actually went back to Minota that night. We were told that Tiffany Powell and Paul did not have a key to the back door, so they routinely left it open. The way it was described to us initially was that they heard the loud bang. We checked the doors. There was no signs of a break-in, no signs of forced entry on the house whatsoever.
In Michael's version of events, the woman had told his father they couldn't go through the front door.
She told him that the carpets had just been cleaned and they had to walk around the back of the house to use the back door so they didn't walk on the carpets. And we had officers check the carpets to make sure that, that they were wet and, it had just been cleaned. The carpets were dry at that point. That immediately drew some red flags for us.
Investigators need to figure out who is telling the truth.
It was particularly important to get access to James' phone, Tiffany's phone, and Paul's phone.
Just to show if there was any conversations or contact between any of those three, trying to prove whether he was there or on his own looking for Tiffany or whether he was there legitimately thinking he was there to make a transaction.
Police submit a warrant for Tiffany and Paul's cell phones.
We had James's phone. Because James was deceased, we didn't need a search warrant to go through his phone. We went through his text messages and we found the text messages telling him to come to Minota to buy the vehicle. It came from a phone number we didn't know. It wasn't Tiffany's, it wasn't Paul's.
Is this the mystery woman Michael saw?
She was messaging James about the car and also about a possible washer and dryer.
Now police want to know, who is the woman that lured James to the home?
Detectives decide to see what Tiffany and Paul have to say about it.
Here's the thing, man. I'm just gonna break it down for you. We have evidence, phone records, that shows that somebody lured him over to that house. Okay?
Somebody called him and had him.
There was no call from me.
No, but there was calls from his phone that match what these witnesses are telling us, so we know it's true.
I had no idea about that.
Okay.
I just find it amazing that nobody seems to know who this person was that was calling him, but yet this mysterious person called him to your guys' house.
Is that?
unbelievable. Either you or Tiffany would know why some mysterious person would call him and bring him to that house. That makes absolutely no
I
sense.
understand what you're saying. It doesn't make no sense. It makes no sense to me. I'm at a loss. Okay, because you said that there was another person there. I had no idea about anybody being there, period. Okay, except Tiffany and I. That's it. That's all I knew about. I don't know anything about somebody calling him.
James was called and lured to that house.
It was called what?
He was called on the phone and he was lured to that house.
By who?
That's what we're asking you.
All we know is we got a dead guy in the basement and people lying to us.
The question is, who was it that was at that house tonight with the two of you that told him to lure?
There was nobody there besides her and I that I know of.
It was me and Paul.
Is there anybody else there?
No.
Let's not play the game,
You
okay?
get yourself in a lot of trouble. Okay, so you need to start telling us the truth.
I understand what you're saying, sir.
Now, obviously you don't.
After hours of questioning, neither Tiffany nor Paul admits knowing anything about this other woman.
All we had was a phone number, so we were searching around the backyard and stuff, and just for the heck of it, I called the number that sent the text messages, and the phone rang right at our feet.
Akron, Ohio investigators looking into the death of James Harris have just discovered messages from an unknown source, luring him to the scene. Neither Tiffany Powell nor Paul Reed seem to know anything about it, leaving investigators to wonder who the sender is and how they're connected.
I called the number that sent the text messages, and the phone rang right at our feet. We were standing on the west side of the house, and the phone was there. We started doing some checks to see who that phone was registered to.
While police work to find the owner of the phone, detectives confront Tiffany and Paul with their newfound evidence.
Good news. Such boss would be in a second. We found the phone that lured your child's father up there. It was in your side yard hidden by a fence. We found it.
Okay.
He came to a house to look at a car and got ambushed.
He didn't come to look at no car, sir. I swear to God, he didn't come to look at no car.
Why was this phone calling him, trying to sell him a car from your house?
There was nobody from my house calling him, sir. But I do not want him dead. I did not want him dead at all.
Then why was the person on this phone calling him, getting him to come to your house?
Despite the evidence, Tiffany doesn't sway.
You guys actually think I want him dead? You think I'm about to have a baby? I don't want him dead.
You caused him to be lured to your house tonight, and he is dead. Whether you wanted him or dead or not is irrelevant.
I was freaking shocked when he came here, okay? I swear to God, I was freaking shocked. I was upset because he knew the address.
You're lying.
Questioning Tiffany and Paul went off and on for hours. We would interview one, then leave and interview another one.
Sorry, dude.
It's time for you to start being honest. That's what time it is.
Check it out, man. We went back out to your place. We found the phone. Not your phone. We found a phone that was calling that man's phone and lured him to your house. It was laying in the yard.
I didn't know about that.
I'm going to tell you the same thing we told Tiffany. Somebody was there, made phone calls to James and lured him to that house.
Who lured him there?
That's what we're asking you.
I have no idea about that at all. I have no idea. I just know a guy breaks into my house with a gun and I'm trying to defend myself. That's all that I know. If someone called him and lured him there, that I had no idea.
Paul and Tiffany continue to deny and deflect.
At some point during the interviews, they decided they didn't want to answer any more questions.
Can I call a lawyer or somebody?
It is time for you to tell the truth.
If you're gonna lock me up, just lock me up, okay? Just call me. I ain't got nothing else to say, 'cause I don't know about that.
Investigators aren't buying the couple's story and focus on finding the owner of the phone.
Eventually, we came up with a name and a number from Canton, Ohio.
Police discovered that the mystery woman's name is Connie Arnold.
We started getting information about who Connie was, and then we contacted her.
19-year-old Connie Arnold agrees to speak with investigators.
Connie's version to the police is that she did in fact lure James to the home, that she directed James to the back of the house.
She says she did it after she was asked to by Tiffany.
According to Connie, it all began when she met Tiffany a few months earlier.
Connie told us that she had met Tiffany in a women's shelter for battered and abused women. They had developed a friendship.
Tiffany claimed that James had been abusive to both her and her children.
Tiffany told Connie that there was an order of protection against James. So she thought that if she lured James to the home, he would violate the order of protection and she would be given her kids back.
Connie says after hearing Tiffany's story, she agreed to help.
They bought a drop phone, and they gave the drop phone to Connie.
She paid her $100 to reach out to James and get him to come to this house under the ruse of looking at a car and a washing machine that were for sale.
Connie says that James agreed to meet her at the house on Minota Avenue later that evening.
She walked him down the basement to where the washer and dryer was.
Connie tells police that what happens next made her run for her life.
That's where Paul Reed was waiting with a metal pole. He started hitting James with the metal pole. She said she had no idea that there was going to be an assault. She was scared and she fled the house.
She immediately ran to a neighbor's yard and she dropped that cell phone.
She says she has no idea what they did with the pole.
Connie's allegations sound credible, and police decide not to charge her with a crime.
When officers are able to get access to Tiffany's phone, they find a conversation between Tiffany and Connie where there is a discussion about exchange of money to get James to Tiffany's house.
When James Harris's autopsy results come in, they tip the scales further.
We were informed that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head.
There are 15 different points of impact on his skull. There are also bruises on his body, on his legs, and on his back as well.
His injuries were consistent with a person having their head smashed repeatedly onto a concrete floor.
While it's impossible to say if a metal pipe landed the first blow to James's body, the medical examiner is certain about one detail.
The medical examiner said that James had no defensive wounds. This usually means that the victim didn't have a chance to fight.
Once we knew that he had died from blunt force trauma and that he had been lured to the house, we contacted our prosecutor's office.
Paul and Tiffany are both charged with aggravated murder and obstruction of justice. The state agrees to separate their trials.
It made more sense to try them separately. At this point, Paul is claiming self-defense, which is a completely different strategy versus what Tiffany is claiming is that she didn't actually commit the murder.
While in jail, Tiffany gives birth to their child. Prosecutors prepare for both trials and place the spotlight on motive.
We believe that Tiffany orchestrated this entire thing.
Tiffany did this for Paul.
February 2015, Akron, Ohio. 1 year after Tiffany Powell and her boyfriend Paul Reed were charged with the murder of Tiffany's ex-boyfriend James Harris, Paul goes to trial.
The prosecutors in this case had all the evidence that they needed. They have communications from a cell phone. They have all the parties at the same place at the same time where this murder is being committed, and they also have a witness who observes the entire thing.
Prosecutors claim that on the night of April 26, 2014, James didn't surprise Paul with a gun. It was the other way around.
Prosecutors believe that when James entered the basement, Paul immediately hit him with the pipe.
Their theory was that James never had an opportunity to defend himself. After that, Paul kneeled on James's back and struck his head against the floor. It was those repeated hits on the floor that caused the skull and brain injuries to James.
Although Tiffany doesn't testify against her baby's father, Connie does and seals Paul's fate.
She was there at the time that the murder happened, saw firsthand what Paul did to James, and so having an eyewitness to the murder is key for the prosecution.
Paul is found guilty of murder and complicity to commit murder, but the obstruction of justice charge is dropped. At sentencing, the judge doesn't go easy on him.
In March of 2015, the judge sentences Paul to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years.
The following year, Tiffany's trial gets underway in January of 2016. Prosecutors say that this all started because Tiffany Powell wanted a new life with her man.
We believe that Tiffany orchestrated this entire thing because she wanted James out of the way so that she could raise Paul's child with her children without having to deal with James in the future.
Tiffany did this for Paul, to have her relationship with Paul, to have her kids back, to have what you would call a core family unit, all of her children and Paul living together, getting James out of the picture.
They explained that James had been given temporary custody of their 5 children, but the final decision was about to be made on May 5th, 2014, a little more than a week after his murder. She knew she had to do something soon.
I think she craved having that stability and having that relationship. Anybody can do anything out of desperation.
Prosecutors say that she befriended Connie at the shelter and lied to her about a civil protection order to get her to lure James to the house.
That night, he goes to take a look at that vehicle and that washing machine.
Once he was there, the plan was for her new boyfriend to kill her old boyfriend and make it look like self-defense.
The plan was thwarted because James wasn't alone.
James's son was in the vehicle. He had brought James over to the house.
Tiffany's defense says that wasn't what she intended to happen at all.
The defense for Tiffany paints a picture that she is an abused woman, a victim of domestic violence.
I definitely think they were trying to hammer home, sort of the difficult situation that she had been in her life. The idea that she'd had a really tough life.
In a surprising decision, Tiffany takes the stand in her own defense.
Tiffany continues to emphasize that James was abusive during their relationship.
She admits to paying Connie and setting James up, just like Connie had told police.
Tiffany claims that her and Paul had a plan, it just all went wrong. The plan was to call 911 when James got to the house. That was the only thing that was going to go down. She said that the fight was never intended and she never meant for James to get hurt.
It's a radical departure from what she told police in her interview. But it doesn't save her. On January 29, 2016, a jury convicts Tiffany Powell of aggravated murder and obstructing justice.
Tiffany didn't show a lot of emotion when the jury comes back, but I know that it was, a good moment for the adult children of James Harris who were in the courtroom, who were celebrating the jury's decision.
On February 25th, the judge sentences Tiffany to life in prison, plus 30 months.
Tiffany's sentence is likely harsher than Paul's sentence in this case because there was evidence that Tiffany set up this entire plan through the text messages with Connie, that there was motive on Tiffany's part.
Without her, this doesn't happen. And so I think that's why she got more time than he did.
James's children were able to see justice prevail, but they say the claims Tiffany and Paul made against their father were false.
James is remembered as a loving dad who loved his children immensely and a pillar of the community.
In this case, the children are the real victims. Not only did they lose their father to a murder, they've also lost their mother.
All because Tiffany thought she could eliminate one man to have a life with another.
It was the worst decision in her life that she could have ever made because it took her away from her children, who she loved the most.
The bitter wind screaming off Lake Ontario in December of 1986 did not merely bring the freezing frost of a standard Canadian winter. It carried a dense, heavy sense of doom that would permanently alter the psychological landscape of a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in East York. It was an ordinary Thursday evening when the predictable rhythm of this tight-knit community shattered into jagged pieces, exposing a sudden, violent vacuum of terror that would paralyze the city for 4 agonizing decades. A 19-year-old university student, an aspiring musician known to everyone on her street as a bright, gentle soul, stepped off the midnight subway train into the swirling snow and vanished into thin air without a single witness, without a struggle that caught the eye of the transit patrol, leaving behind only a broken silver bracelet on the icy sidewalk and a family whose lives were instantly plunged into an absolute nightmare. The initial response from the Metro Police was a chaotic blur of flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the snowbanks, a frantic, disorganized search through the dense ravines that snake through the city. But as the hours quickly bled into days, the heavy realization settled into the bones of the precinct that they were dealing with an calculating, invisible predator. This was the dark birth of a classic cold case, a sudden disappearance that mocked the uniform and the badge, initiating a multi-generational curse that passed from retiring detectives to wide-eyed rookies who had not even been born when the first frantic radio dispatch pierced the night air. You can still feel the phantom pressure of that winter night if you walk past the subway exit after the streetlights flicker. an invisible, suffocating presence that whispers that the true monster walked the very same streets, completely undetected, while the city kept spinning blindly forward through the decades. The missing person posters eventually faded and peeled away under the relentless Canadian elements, turning into frozen pulp on telephone poles. But the silence she left behind grew louder every single year, a static hum of dread that transformed a peaceful suburb into a permanent psychological crime scene where every greeting felt guarded and every neighbor's smile seemed to hide a dark, unpunished truth. The crime scene itself offered nothing but a masterclass in forensic frustration, a clinical void that left the original investigators staring at the snow in utter disbelief and helpless anger. There were no bloodstains on the fresh drifts, no clear boot prints that could be cast in plaster, and no signs of a struggle that could provide a definitive narrative of the abduction. The entire area possessed a haunting, sterile emptiness that suggested the attacker had weaponized the raging blizzard to erase his physical identity. A comprehensive grid search of the surrounding parklands and frozen riverbeds yielded only fragmented, frustrating dead ends, a single set of tire tracks on a hidden access road that the plows had already partially destroyed, a discarded woolen scarf near the ravine that was too contaminated for fiber analysis, and a series of contradictory statements from homeowners who claimed to have heard a car door slam at 12:30 a.m. but couldn't agree on the direction of the vehicle's engine. The community instantly retreated behind newly installed deadbolts and iron window grates, their eyes filled with a defensive, paranoid suspicion as they watched television news crews descend like crows upon their private grief, turning their sudden tragedy into a sensational headline that screamed of a phantom serial killer lurking in the suburban dark. This was a mystery sealed tight from its very inception, a cold case born from the total absence of physical clues and the paralyzing fear that locked the tongues of anyone who might have seen a shadow moving through the midnight storm. As the weeks froze into a bitter Toronto winter, the initial surge of tips dried up entirely, the investigative task force was quietly downsized, and the thick cardboard file was relegated to a dusty basement shelf in the headquarters archives, its contents destined to warp under the relentless humidity of forgotten time, while the perpetrator walked the earth completely free. The early days of the investigation were defined by a manual, grueling grind that relied on primitive methodologies that were utterly incapable of piercing the veil of anonymity that the killer had wrapped around his crime. Detectives spent months typing up index cards, cross-references of known offenders, transient construction workers, and delivery drivers who had been logged in the East York area on the night of the disappearance. They conducted hundreds of high-pressure interviews, pushing suspect after suspect until their alibis were worn thin, yet every promising lead eventually disintegrated into a dead end, leaving the department with nothing but a collection of shattered theories and broken promises. There was a persistent, whispering theory within the bullpen that the predator was not a drifter passing through from the highway, but a local resident who knew the specific patrol schedules of the division, someone who understood exactly which stretches of the ravine path were entirely unmonitored by civilian eyes. But in an era where DNA profiling was a distant, theoretical concept in a university research lab, suspicion without physical evidence was a useless weapon, and the file slowly became a monument to professional failure, a cold case that mocked the badge and the uniform every single day it remained unsolved. The victim's family was left to navigate a desert of silent grief, their lives permanently fractured by the unknown, forced to live in a town where the monster who had stolen their daughter was likely buying groceries at the same supermarket or sitting next to them at a local diner. As the decades began to blend into one another with a slow, agonizing passage of time, the 1986 case transitioned from an active investigation into a piece of dark local folklore, a cautionary tale that parents used to keep their teenage daughters from walking along the isolated park trails after sunset. The original detectives who had stood in that freezing snow retired one by one, handing over their notes to a new generation of investigators who looked at the yellowing pages with a sense of historical detachment, viewing the crime as a relic of a bygone era that could never be resolved. The landscape of Toronto underwent a dramatic, multi-billion-dollar transformation, The quiet suburbs were paved over with luxury high-rises, modern transit lines rose where the open fields had once been, and the generation that remembered the visceral terror of 1986 began to fade into the local cemeteries, taking their personal suspicions into the earth with them. Yet, the perpetrator remained a living, breathing entity within the grand design of the city, a cold-blooded architect of destruction who had successfully mastered the art of complete social assimilation, watching the world transition into the internet age while remaining entirely invisible to the radar of modern law enforcement. It was a terrifying masterpiece of evasion, a silent pact between a predator and the calendar that suggested some horrors are simply too clean for human justice to correct, leaving the concept of ultimate accountability looking like a hollow fairy tale told to comfort the brokenhearted. Then, the relentless, exponential march of forensic technology reached a sudden, historic tipping point, a silent scientific revolution that didn't care about the passage of 40 years or the fact that the physical evidence had been locked in a dark basement since the 80s. A specialized cold case unit, armed with modern grants and high-tech investigative tools, pulled the 1986 file from its resting place, not because they had received a sudden tip from an old informant, but because the genetic blueprint of human life could now be deciphered from a single, microscopic trace of biological material. Technicians utilized an advanced collection system on the victim's preserved clothing, pulling a pristine profile of the killer from the ancient fabric, a profile that had sat in the dark for decades, waiting for science to catch up to its malice. This profile was injected into the cutting-edge realm of investigative genetic genealogy, a high-tech methodology that searches through vast, public family tree registries to track a suspect through the biological profiles of his distant relatives, his ancestors, and his cousins. The laboratory became a digital cathedral of historical reconstruction, where the blurry, 40-year-old shadow of a suburban monster began to resolve into a sharp, undeniable family lineage that was deeply rooted in the history of the province itself. The high-tech breakthrough did not manifest as a sudden, dramatic arrest in the middle of the night. It arrived as a quiet, mathematical certainty that flashed onto a high-definition computer monitor in a sterile laboratory, an analytical match that sent a collective shockwave through the upper echelons of law enforcement. The algorithm had bypassed 4 decades of human deception, political shifts, and geographic movements by simply tracing the immutable genetic markers of the suspect's distant cousins, mapping a direct line through a massive family tree that ultimately terminated at a single, living lineage. The name that emerged from the digital darkness was an absolute bombshell for the investigators. It pointed directly to a highly respected, quiet neighborhood figure who had lived for 40 years just 3 streets away from the very subway station where the victim had vanished. The predator had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of absolute respectability, operating a successful local repair shop, volunteering at community centers, and raising a family, using his unblemished reputation to insulate himself from the horror of his youth. The detectives stared at the historical photograph of the suspect, their chests tightening as they realized that the monster who had eluded them for a generation had been living as a quiet, unassuming neighbor, smiling at their block parties and walking the very same sidewalks where he had hunted his prey in 1986. The tracking of the suspect took a sudden, dramatic turn when investigators discovered that the aging man had been admitted to a local Toronto hospital just 48 hours prior, his body rapidly failing under the weight of a terminal illness. A team of specialized detectives rushed to the medical facility, navigating the quiet, sterile corridors of the intensive care unit to find the once formidable predator reduced to a frail, withered figure hooked up to a labyrinth of life support machinery. There would be no dramatic pre-dawn raid, no tactical breach of a suburban home. Instead, the final confrontation would take place in the quiet hum of a hospital room, beneath the clinical glare of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor counting down the suspect's final hours on Earth. As the investigators approached the bed, displaying the ancient photograph of the 19-year-old musician, the dying man's eyes flickered with a sudden, sharp spike of acute recognition, the decades of manufactured denial and calculated silence finally evaporating in the face of his impending mortality. The realization that his own genetic code had traveled through 40 years of time to find him on his deathbed broke the remaining structural support of his secrecy, causing his breathing to turn ragged as he prepared to release the ultimate truth that had haunted the community for a generation. Inside that quiet, clinical room, with a digital audio recorder spinning silently on the bedside table, the dying predator began a comprehensive, chilling confession that systematically dismantled 40 years of small-town illusions, his voice a low, raspy whisper that carried the raw weight of absolute malice. He did not offer excuses, nor did he beg for forgiveness. He detailed the anatomy of a 1986 crime with a cold, terrifying precision that demonstrated how easily he had used the chaos of the winter blizzard to execute his plan and evade the primitive dragnet of the era. He explained how he had stalked the victim from the subway platform, using his intimate knowledge of the neighborhood's unlit alleyways to ambush her before she could ever reach the safety of her front porch, carrying her into the dark recesses of a local commercial warehouse he owned at the time. The detectives listened in stunned, breathless silence as the confession expanded into a multi-hour autopsy of a dual existence, with the suspect admitting that he had spent his entire life monitoring the police investigation, attending community vigils for the missing student, and using his local business to subtly fund charity drives for victims of violence simply to burnish his image as a compassionate community leader. The sudden, shocking news of the deathbed confession tore through the East York neighborhood like a psychological wildfire, transforming decades of unresolved grief into a profound, destabilizing wave of community shock and existential betrayal. People who had known the suspect for 40 years, who had trusted him with their homes, their businesses, and their children, were suddenly forced to reckon with the terrifying reality that the architect of their neighborhood safety was the very same monster who had authored their greatest tragedy. The local repair shop he had operated for decades became an immediate focal point of public revulsion, its windows covered in police tape, and its interior searched by forensic teams looking for any hidden trophies or records that might link the deceased killer to other unresolved cold cases within the city. The shock was accompanied by a deep, defensive introspection among the older residents, who spent their evenings replaying 40 years of mundane interactions with the suspect, suddenly remembering the strange, volatile flashes of temper he had occasionally displayed and his intense, aggressive refusal to ever discuss the 1986 disappearance whenever the topic arose during community meetings. The legal and administrative closing of the case was an immediate, clinical process that took place just hours after the suspect drew his final breath, with the Crown prosecutor formally signing the documents that marked the 1986 archive as officially resolved via an exceptional deathbed statement. The physical file, a massive cardboard box filled with 40 years of human failure, broken leads, and yellowed documents, was stamped with a heavy red ink mark that read "Closed. Perpetrator deceased," a simple bureaucratic action that permanently ended the longest-running criminal nightmare in the history of the division. But as the records clerk placed the box onto the permanent archive shelf alongside the closed files of historic property disputes, the atmosphere in the precinct remained heavy with the knowledge that a deathbed confession could not truly heal the structural scars the killer had inflicted on the soul of the community. The suspect had escaped a public trial, he had evaded a maximum security prison sentence, and he had lived his entire life in absolute comfort and luxury, leaving the town to deal with the messy, unresolved residue of a justice that had arrived too late to offer any true retribution. The sirens have long since faded from the quiet residential streets of East York, and the television news trucks have packed up their gear to chase newer, fresher horrors in other zip codes. But the silence that has settled over the Toronto neighborhood is not the peaceful quiet of a mystery solved. It is the hollow, haunted stillness of a community that has discovered its history was built on a magnificent, terrifying lie. The 1986 cold case is technically finished, the digital ledger in the city's judicial database marked with a final seal of completion, but the psychological trauma left behind by the predator's dual existence has become a permanent, structural element of the local landscape. You can see it in the way the current residents pass the old subway exit in hushed, guarded silence, The way the local police officers avoid looking at the historical division photos on the wall, and the way the elderly neighbors still lock their doors early whenever the winter wind begins to howl off Lake Ontario. The high-tech resolution did not bring back the bright young musician who was erased from the world on that freezing December night, nor did it undo the 40 years of silent terror that reshaped the character of an entire generation. It merely proved that justice is a patient, unpredictable hunter that will always, inevitably, pull the truth out of the dark, even if it has to wait until a monster's very last breath to claim its victory. The raspy, final breaths of the dying predator inside that sterile Toronto intensive care unit did not dissolve into a clean sense of civic closure. Instead, they solidified into a heavy, historical toxin that settled deep into the soil of East York, forcing an entire city to re-examine the decades they had spent sleeping under the same roof as an absolute monster. The digital audio recorder sitting on the bedside table had captured every low, unrepentant whisper, a mechanical transcription of malice that turned 40 years of neighborhood history into a grotesque sequence of performance art. As the news of the deathbed confession broke through the local media networks, a second and far more insidious shockwave ripped through the quiet residential avenues, not from the sudden violence of a historical crime, but from the terrifying systemic realization that the community's defensive grid had been entirely useless against an insider who lived just 3 doors down from the point of abduction. The cardboard boxes that had dominated the division's archive for 40 years were no longer symbols of an elusive phantom. They were now a glaring monument to a collective blindness that had allowed a local tradesman to wash the blood from his hands, open his shop the next morning, and actively dictate the terms of his own absolute immunity. The specialized cold case task force quickly realized that the killer's death was not the end of their mandate, but the beginning of a massive, multi-jurisdictional post-mortem investigation aimed at dismantling the structural framework of his double life. Investigators from the Ontario Provincial Police and Toronto Metro Division converged on the deceased suspect's suburban property, sealing off the modest detached home and the adjacent repair shop with layers of heavy plastic sheeting and high-visibility evidence barriers. They were not looking for a living suspect. They were looking for the physical residue of a 40-year cover-up, deploying advanced forensic techniques to extract the invisible historical data trapped within the walls of his life. Technicians utilizing specialized chemical enhancement sprays moved through the dark recesses of the repair shop's basement, searching for the microscopic biological phantoms of past violence that time, industrial solvents, and deliberate maintenance could not completely erase from the concrete foundation. Every filing cabinet, every historical tax ledger, and every private diary found within the residence was systematically seized and loaded into unmarked police vans, turning a quiet neighborhood street into an active, high-density archaeological excavation of human depravity. As the financial and administrative investigators began to piece together the timeline of the suspect's operations in the late 1980s, a deeply disturbing pattern of geographic and commercial manipulation began to take shape from the columns of data. The suspect had not been a passive observer of the city's development. He had systematically leveraged his local business relationships to gain unmonitored access to the very infrastructure that the police were using to track the predator. The logs revealed that in the winters following the 1986 disappearance, the suspect had secured municipal maintenance contracts for several commercial facilities and public parks bordering the East York Ravine system, effectively giving him a legitimate, government-approved excuse to hover around the perimeters of the active search zones at all hours of the night. This wasn't an elusive drifter dodging a transit patrol. It was a cold-blooded sociopath utilizing the administrative machinery of the city to map the blind spots of the law, ensuring that his private movements remained completely shielded behind the high-visibility vest of a trusted local contractor. The psychological impact of these unfolding revelations initiated a profound moral collapse across the multi-generational households of East York, turning lifelong friends into guarded, defensive adversaries who spent their evenings reviewing 40 years of neighborhood casual interactions through an inverted lens. People who had known the suspect since the 1980s, men who had gone fishing with him on Lake Ontario, women who had bought his custom metalwork, and children who had played on his front lawn, felt a sudden, visceral wave of nausea as they realized that his quiet, unassuming helpfulness was a calculated mask engineered to buy their absolute, unconscious loyalty. The local community center, where the suspect had frequently volunteered to repair equipment and build stage sets for youth theater productions, held an emergency board session to authorize the immediate destruction of every physical item he had ever touched, the empty spaces in the gymnasium looking like architectural wounds that mirrored the internal desolation of the town itself. The older residents were forced to live in a state of continuous self-reproach, realizing that their natural desire for small-town comfort and neighborly trust had been converted by a predator into the ultimate cloaking device. While the neighborhood tore itself apart with suspicion and historical guilt, the high-tech forensic pathology laboratories in downtown Toronto continued their relentless analysis of the secondary evidence recovered from the suspect's residence, treating his verified genetic profile as a master key to a larger, historical puzzle. The scientists were utilizing advanced mass spectrometry and high-resolution digital scanning to cross-reference the microscopic traces found in his old toolboxes with unresolved missing person profiles and historical assault cases from across the entire province of Ontario. Every run of the laboratory's computer models was a clinical battle against the natural decay of biological material that had been hidden in dark corners for nearly half a century, a high-stakes scientific attempt to determine if the 1986 disappearance was an isolated flash of madness or the terrifying centerpiece of a hidden, multi-decade career of serial predation. The atmosphere inside the laboratory remained one of hushed, military intensity, with technicians understanding that their data was the only remaining force capable of delivering a complete narrative of accountability now that the killer himself had escaped the living jurisdiction of the court. The administrative closing of the case files brought no relief to the victim's surviving family, who found themselves thrust into a bizarre, media-saturated vacuum of closure without retribution, a state of psychological limbo that was deeply destabilizing. They were flooded with predatory communication from international true crime networks, book publishers, and digital media producers who descended upon their quiet street like crows, eager to transform their 40 years of silent agony into a slick, commercialized narrative for a global audience. The daughter, who had spent her entire conscious life carrying the heavy, frozen memory of the bright young musician who never came home from the subway station, chose to lock her doors against the modern world, refusing to allow the commercialization of her mother's death to erase the raw human cost of the delay. She understood with a devastating, protective clarity that the deathbed confession was not an act of remorse or a gift of peace from a dying man. It was a final, arrogant assertion of control by a killer who waited until the absolute threshold of his own mortality to reveal the truth, ensures that the state would never have the opportunity to lock him in a maximum security cell or strip him of his comfortable citizen lifestyle. As the spring thaws began to release Toronto from the grip of another bitter winter, the local transit division held a quiet, unpublicized ceremony at the East York subway exit, installing a modest bronze plaque bearing the victim's name and the date she was stolen from the world. The event was attended by only a handful of retired officers and aging neighbors who had stood in the swirling blizzard of 1986, their frail frames and white hair a testament to the staggering duration of the trauma that had defined their community for a generation. The plaque was a permanent, structural admission of a historical failure, a reminder that the safety of the public is a fragile, easily broken illusion that requires constant, unyielding vigilance to maintain against the predators who walk among the innocent. The investigators who had closed the file stood at the edge of the platform in absolute silence, watching the modern commuters stream past the bronze marker without blinking, their busy, indifferent energy a proof that while the system can occasionally balance the legal ledger through science, it can never truly undo the structural damage a cold case inflicts on the memory of a city. The physical repair shop that the suspect had operated on Main Street for 40 years, a building that had been a mundane fixture of the local economy since the 80s, was eventually purchased by a municipal land trust at a public tax auction and scheduled for immediate, total demolition, an event that many residents felt was a necessary, architectural exorcism of the neighborhood space. Heavy industrial wrecking crews arrived on a gray, misty morning, their diesel engines roaring into the quiet suburb as their hydraulic claws tore through the brick facade, the weathered wooden rafters, and the reinforced concrete foundation where the forensic teams had spent months hunting for ghosts. The structure was completely reduced to a mountain of raw, anonymous industrial waste that was hauled away in a continuous convoy of dump trucks, leaving behind nothing but an empty, leveled lot of gravel and dirt that offered no comfort and no memory to the passing generation. The town had chosen to erase the building from its geography, a physical declaration that some histories are too toxic to be preserved in the visual landscape of their daily lives, leaving the space to be slowly reclaimed by the native weeds and the indifferent passage of time. The legacy of the Toronto cold case was ultimately not a story of a system working seamlessly to correct its own errors, but a chilling, multi-layered autopsy of how easily a small, decent community can be hollowed out from the inside by a predator who understands the social value of a quiet performance. The 1986 folder was closed. The red stamp in the division basement was dry. The repair shop was a gravel lot, and the killer was a handful of ash in an unmarked cemetery, but the internal character of East York had been permanently altered by the realization that their decades of peace were a manufactured illusion, a product of a continuous, calculated deception that had walked among them unrecognized for 40 years. The community had used the unassailable power of modern forensic science to trace the genetic path of the monster directly to his deathbed, but they had paid for that truth with the very fabric of their multi-generational security, leaving behind a heartland landscape that would move into the future with a permanent, defensive limp. A collective awareness that the wolves who hunt the innocent do not wait on the edges of the dark, but walk down the center aisle of the front row, wearing the tailored suits of public office, smiling at your families, and directing the very laws that are meant to keep the dark from breaking through. The complete structural evacuation of the deceased suspect's property did not bring an end to the administrative nightmare gripping the Toronto Police Service. Instead, it initiated a grueling, deep-dive excavation into the historical archives of the division that threatened to expose decades of systemic investigative paralysis. As the boxes of seized diaries, customer logbooks, and personal financial ledgers from the mid-1980s were systematically uploaded into the department's modern data matrix, a terrifying picture of administrative sterilization began to materialize before the eyes of the specialized task force. Investigators from the homicide unit sat in sterile, glare-lit rooms for weeks, cross-referencing the repair shop's historical work orders with the original 1986 canvas sheets, realizing with a sudden, visceral wave of professional failure that the killer's name had appeared in the initial master files 3 separate times during the first month of the abduction. He hadn't been an invisible ghost operating in a total vacuum. He had been an active participant in the periphery of the investigation, a local businessman who had volunteered his shop's custom fabrication tools to build auxiliary search barriers for the community, a strategic move that allowed him to walk directly into the precinct, look his own hunters in the eyes, and subtly learn the exact limits of their forensic capabilities. The physical remnants of this 40-year deception were meticulously laid out across the metal tables of the state's secure processing facility, transforming the clinical laboratory into a dark museum dedicated to a dual existence that had mocked the concept of justice for a generation. Technicians utilizing advanced multispectral imaging began analyzing the suspect's private journals from the winter of 1986, discovering that beneath his outer persona of a quiet, civic-minded tradesman lay a cold, hyper-analytical mind that treated his survival as a continuous logistical problem to be solved through calculated assimilation. The pages did not contain dramatic, emotional confessions of remorse. They were filled with detailed, neatly organized records of regional weather patterns, metro transit schedule variations, and the specific names of the neighborhood watch volunteers who patrolled the East York Ravine lines. It was an absolute autopsy of a sociopathic intelligence, proof that his entire public legacy as a generous neighbor who repaired children's bicycles for free was an artificial layer of defense, a fortress built out of mundane acts of community charity designed to buy the total, permanent blindness of the people who lived right next door to his hunting grounds. The weight of these administrative disclosures quickly ruptured the fragile peace of the surrounding neighborhood, destroying the remaining multi-generational social bonds and turning the quiet residential streets into a battleground of intense paranoia and historical self-examination. Older residents who had sat on local civic boards with the suspect during the 1990s began to look back at their old interactions through a completely inverted lens, realizing that his obsessive punctuality, his insistence on managing the locks and keys of the neighborhood center, and his intense, volatile aversion to any public discussion involving unsolved crimes were not the eccentricities of an intense worker, but the active defense mechanisms of a monster hiding in plain sight. The local Commerce Association, which had recently featured the suspect's repair shop in a retrospective publication celebrating the historical anchors of East York, held a closed-door emergency session to authorize the total destruction of every archival record bearing his image, the empty display windows on Main Street looking like raw physical wounds on the landscape of the town. The psychological trauma inflicted upon the community's oldest families was absolute. They were forced to acknowledge that their collective desire for a safe, predictable suburban paradise had converted their neighborhood into a protective incubator for a predator who had stolen a 19-year-old girl's future. While the community turned inward, destroying its own social connections through a continuous loop of suspicion and historical guilt, the forensic pathology laboratories in downtown Toronto continued their automated, high-tech tracking of the suspect's verified genetic profile, treating his DNA sequence as a universal skeleton key that could unlock other unresolved mysteries across the province. Scientists utilized advanced, high-density single nucleotide polymorphism arrays to compare the biological markers recovered from his residence with the microscopic traces preserved in dozens of unsolved cold cases from the late 20th century, looking for the telltale signatures of a wider career of serial predation. Every separate run of the laboratory's computer models was an absolute race against the natural decay of historical evidence that had been locked in suboptimal provincial storage lockers since the 70s and 80s. The technicians moved through the ancient evidence bins with a hushed, military intensity, understanding that their data was the only remaining force capable of delivering a complete narrative of legal accountability now that the perpetrator himself had escaped the jurisdiction of the living world through his deathbed confession. The administrative closing of the 1986 homicide file brought no release to the victim's family, who found themselves trapped in an agonizing, media-saturated vacuum of closure without retribution, a state of psychological suspension that felt deeply hollow. They were flooded with predatory communication from international true crime documentary producers, literary agents, and digital media corporations who descended upon their home like vultures, eager to monetize their 40 years of silent agony into a slick, commercialized narrative for a global audience. The daughter, who had spent her entire adult life carrying the heavy, frozen memory of the bright young musician who never returned from the East York subway exit, chose to lock her doors against the modern world, refusing to allow the commercialization of her mother's death to erase the raw human cost of a delay. She understood with a devastating, protective clarity that the deathbed statement was not an act of grace or a gift of peace from a dying man. It was a final, arrogant assertion of control by a killer who waited until the absolute threshold of his own mortality to reveal the truth, ensuring that the state would never have the opportunity to lock him in a maximum security cell or strip him of his comfortable, respected lifestyle. The tracking of the suspect's financial networks revealed an intricate system of small-scale corporate sheltering that the killer had utilized during the 1990s to insulate his business from any potential state scrutiny, a discovery that added another layer of calculated malice to his historical profile. Forensic accountants from the Revenue Department uncovered a series of private bank accounts registered under dummy corporate names that were used to fund local political campaigns and civic police charities, strategic donations that always seemed to align with shifts in regional law enforcement leadership or the allocation of funds for cold case review units. The realization that their own local taxes and community donations had been actively manipulated by a predator to purchase his own institutional invisibility was a profound, sickening revelation for the residents of East York, forcing them to understand that the clean, well-lit sidewalks they walked upon were the literal byproducts of a deal made with a monster. A collective bribe paid to an entire population to keep them from looking too closely at the darkness lurking in their midst. As the summer sun began to bake the city of Toronto, turning the concrete avenues of East York into a shimmering field of heat that matched the volatile emotional atmosphere of the neighborhood, the provincial government announced the formation of an independent judicial inquiry to investigate the historical handling of the 1986 investigation. The inquiry, headed by a retired Supreme Court justice, was designed to hold a series of public, recorded hearings that would force the remaining members of the original 1986 task force to stand before a microphone and answer for the dropped leads, the missing logbook entries, and the total failure of imagination that had allowed a serial predator to operate unpunished in their territory for 40 years. The announcement turned the local courthouse into a zone of immense structural tension, with aging former detectives hiring expensive defense lawyers to protect their professional legacies and pensions from being dragged into a public indictment of institutional negligence. The town was being forced to watch a public autopsy of its own history, a process that stripped away the remaining comfort of small-town nostalgia to reveal a dark infrastructure of systemic incompetence that had left a killer completely untouched for half a century. The physical site of the original crime scene, the quiet, narrow street corner just outside the subway exit where the broken silver bracelet had been found glinting in the snow 40 years ago, had become a dark destination for true crime tourists who arrived on weekends, their slow-moving vehicles and flashing camera lenses infuriating the local business owners who wanted the history of the block to be forgotten. The sidewalk had been repaired. The old lighting fixtures where the shadows had lengthened in 1986 were replaced by modern high-intensity LEDs, and the surrounding buildings were filled with trendy retail shops, but the structural memory of that freezing December night could not be renovated out of the neighborhood's consciousness. Neighbors who had lived on the avenue for 40 years still found themselves staring at the asphalt whenever a winter storm began to blow off the lake, their minds instantly replaying the image of the flashing emergency lights from their youth and the cold, terrifying realization that the polite, helpful repairman who had stood with them on the curb offering condolences was the one who had carried the girl into the dark. The street had become a psychological monument to their own collective failure, a permanent reminder of how easily they had allowed themselves to be comforted by the polite words of an insider while the monster was standing right in front of them. Deep within the Municipal Archives building, the physical 1986 file was finally placed into a specialized long-term security vault, a climate-controlled room reserved exclusively for the historical artifacts of the city's most significant legal resolutions. The box, reinforced with synthetic bindings and marked with the definitive electronic tracking tags of the modern era, sat on a steel shelf in absolute darkness, a silent testament to the fact that while the passage of time can freeze a mystery into stone, it can never truly bury the truth from the unyielding reach of modern science. For the younger detectives who visited the archive as part of their advanced forensic training, the 1991 case marker was a foundational lesson in the necessity of data persistence, proof that every single item handled at a crime scene is a message sent across time, a biological signature that will eventually outlive the criminal's lies, outlive his wealth, and outlive the social capital he used to protect his freedom. The file was no longer an active tool of the hunt. It was an unassailable piece of the city's history, a chilling proof that justice is a patient, cold-blooded hunter that doesn't care about the calendar or the status of a target, moving forward with a mechanical certainty that will eventually drag every historical horror out of the dark and into the light. As the weeks turned into months and the independent inquiry began to wind down its public sessions, the international media teams finally packed up their gear and moved on to find newer, fresher horrors in other zip codes, leaving East York to confront the long, slow, and agonizing process of living with its own altered identity. The 1986 cold case was officially over, the red stamp in the division archive was dry, and the repair shop was an empty gravel lot that was slowly being overgrown with weeds, but the residual poison left by the killer's double life remained deeply embedded in the character of the community. The town had survived the monster. It had used the power of modern forensic science to trace his genetic code directly to his deathbed, and it had forced his final secret into the open air, but it had paid for that truth with its innocence, leaving behind a suburban landscape that would move into the future with a permanent, defensive vigilance. The story of the Toronto repairman was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a permanent, haunting truth carved into the bedrock of the heartland, a reminder that the wolves who hunt the innocent do not wait on the edges of the dark, but walk down the center aisle of the front row, wearing the tailored suits of public office or the dusty overalls of local trade, smiling at your families, and directing the very laws that are meant to keep the dark from breaking through. The clinical publication of the Independent Judicial Inquiry's interim report marked the precise moment the historical narrative of the Toronto repairman transformed from a tragic tale of an elusive phantom into a damning indictment of systemic institutional failure. The digitized transcripts of the 1986 emergency radio traffic, cross-referenced with the suspect's newly uncovered corporate bank records, filled the massive high-definition monitors of the downtown hearing room, casting a cold, technical glow over the assembled row of current and former police administrators. The modern public sat in a state of transfixed, horrified silence as the inquiry's lead counsel utilized an automated data timeline to map the movements of Division 54 patrol cruisers on that freezing December night, demonstrating with mathematical precision that the killer had exploited a critical 20-minute communication dead zone to execute his plan. The visual clarity of the algorithmic reconstruction effectively bridged the 40-year temporal chasm, rendering the historical excuses of the pre-digital era completely obsolete against the unassailable, mechanical truth of the department's own data logs. The legal representatives of the Retired Police Association, visibly shaken by the clinical impact of the digital overlay, scrambled to inject a counter-narrative of historical context into the formal record, launching an aggressive defense of the 1986 investigative team's methodologies. They called a series of elderly former desk sergeants to the stand, trying to paint a picture of a metropolitan division that was fundamentally overwhelmed by the sheer volume of emergency calls triggered by the historic winter blizzard, and chaotic environment where handwritten logbook entries were frequently misplaced, radio channels overlapped, and manual filing boxes were handled by exhausted rookies. The lead defense counsel raised his voice, his tone sharp and combative as he demanded to know how a modern inquiry, operating with the luxurious hindsight of 21st-century data tracking, could fairly judge the frantic, split-second decisions of officers navigating a whiteout storm without the aid of cell phones, global positioning systems, or automated fingerprint networks. It was a calculated, expensive attempt to shift the blame from individual complacency to institutional limitation, a desperate effort to convince the public that the failure to capture the predator in 1986 was an unavoidable tragedy of a primitive technological era rather than a catastrophic lapse in basic police vigilance. But this administrative smokescreen dissolved completely the instant the inquiry team introduced its next forensic asset, a series of internal warehouse logistics logs from the winter of 1987, recovered from a hidden floor safe during the final demolition of the suspect's Main Street repair shop. The state prosecutors methodically demonstrated to the panel that the commercial facility where the suspect had processed his custom metal fabrication orders had been subjected to a routine municipal zoning inspection just 6 months after the 19-year-old musician vanished from the subway exit. The logs revealed that the suspect had personally signed off on a series of structural modifications to the building's subterranean storage bays during the exact week of the active ravine searches, modifications that were manually entered into the county ledger as routine insulation upgrades, but were actually designed to create a reinforced, soundproof workspace beneath the concrete foundation. The reveal was a tactical hammer blow that turned the historical narrative upside down. The total absence of physical clues at the subway exit wasn't a miracle of criminal luck, but the result of a calculated, architectural containment executed by an insider who held the commercial clearances to build an absolute tomb right under the noses of the local zoning boards. Outside the secure walls of the hearing room, the East York neighborhood was experiencing a slow, agonizing moral collapse as the details of the warehouse modifications leaked into the community, exposing the terrifying ease with which the killer had integrated his predatory impulses into the daily mechanics of local trade. Longtime residents who had hired the suspect to reinforce their own basement windows, install heavy iron deadbolts on their doors, and weld secure gates for their businesses felt a sudden, visceral wave of nausea as they realized that the tools used to secure their private sanctuaries were the exact same implements that had built a chamber of horrors just streets away. The local business improvement area, which had recently planned a memorial dedication to honor the multi-generational merchants of Main Street, canceled the initiative overnight, the blank walls of the commercial strip looking like physical scars on the landscape, matching the internal desolation of a community that realized its decades of peaceful, suburban prosperity had been directly subsidized by the calculated silence of an unpunished monster. The inquiry reached a new level of clinical intensity when the state called a forensic structural engineer who specialized in the long-term preservation of microtraces within sealed industrial environments, a witness whose testimony was designed to connect the suspect's private trade logs directly to the final, hidden mechanics of the cover-up. Using advanced ground-penetrating radar data and chemical core sampling charts compiled during the final clearance of the gravel lot, the expert explained to the panel that the soil beneath the repair shop's old hydraulic lift showed localized anomalies that perfectly matched a chemical disturbance from the exact late winter window of 1987. The lawyers for the retired officers objected frantically, their voices cracking with tension as they argued that industrial solvents, motor oils, and commercial lubricants were standard across every automotive and repair facility in East York, and that the testimony was purely speculative, intended only to inflame the passions of the public. But the presiding judge, her face an unbending mask of judicial neutrality, overruled the objections, allowing the engineer to project a molecular analysis that showed a rare, high-grade commercial sealant that had only been distributed to licensed industrial contractors who held private accounts with the suspect's primary corporate supply chain. The atmosphere in the room turned ice-cold as the prosecutor asked the expert to describe the specific degradation patterns of that industrial sealant when exposed to the heavy subterranean moisture of the Toronto ravine system over a 40-year period, forcing the audience to listen to a cold, chemical description of how a structure can hold onto the signature of its creator across generations of time. The deceased killer's surviving relatives sat perfectly still in the back row of the gallery, their faces pale and bloodless under the harsh glare of the studio lights, their eyes fixed on the floor as if they were trying to shrink away from the absolute public ruin of their family name. The community was being forced to realize that the man they had celebrated as a reliable, hard-working neighbor, the quiet craftsman who had welded the security grates for their local schools, was a master of chemical and structural evasion who had used his intimate knowledge of industrial logistics to shield his movements from the unyielding reach of the law. As the third week of the public hearings ground toward its conclusion, the inquiry dropped its most devastating administrative bomb, calling to the stand a former municipal records clerk who had managed the city's construction permit archive during the late 1990s. A woman who had left Ontario abruptly in 2002 and had lived in total anonymity in rural British Columbia until she was located by a team of provincial marshals. The witness was now an elderly woman, her voice trembling with a mixture of historical terror and immediate panic as she looked across the well of the hearing room at the empty chair of the suspect who had once held absolute power over her livelihood and her family's safety. Under direct examination, the archivist revealed that in the winter of 1999, during a routine digitization of the East York commercial property registries, she had been approached by a prominent local developer, a man whose municipal election campaigns had been entirely financed by the suspect's private business syndicates, who casually suggested that certain older, paper-based structural blueprints from the mid-'80s were taking up valuable vault space and should be moved to an unindexed, off-site storage facility that lacked security cameras or fire suppression systems. The clerk's testimony provided the missing structural link that connected the repairman's local economic network directly to the active suppression of historical data, proving to the panel that his evasion of justice was not a passive miracle of science, but a continuous, multi-decade campaign of political influence and institutional sterilization that had started before the victim's family had even stopped weeping. The witness described living for over 20 years in a state of self-imposed exile, changing her phone numbers, checking the security deadbolts on her house every single night, and refusing to look at any news coming out of Toronto because she understood that as long as that tradesman's business network held power in East York, her knowledge of the missing blueprints made her a permanent liability to an empire built on a foundation of blood. The cross-examination by the police association lawyers was an exercise in pure structural aggression, trying to paint the elderly clerk as an unstable former employee who was fabricating a Hollywood-style municipal conspiracy to settle an old administrative grudge against her former supervisors. But her terror was too palpable, her memory of the specific political threats too detailed, and her description of the altered city council memos matched too perfectly with the cold, calculating administrative patterns the inquiry team had already uncovered in the corporate logs. The weight of this accumulation of evidence began to take a visible, physical toll on the city's current administrative leadership, who were now arriving at the hearings each morning with the hollow eyes and exhausted postures of public servants who knew they were trapped in a room with a history that could not be defended by normal bureaucratic public relations. They were no longer releasing polished, reassuring press statements to the local true crime bloggers or the mainstream networks. They rushed past the microphones with their heads down, their briefcases clutched to their chests like shields, their confident public declarations of community safety replaced by a total, sullen silence that perfectly mirrored the dark reality of the documents being entered into the record. The community outside had reached a state of emotional saturation, a collective realization that the independent inquiry was not just a historical review of a single unsolved crime, but an autopsy of an entire era of Toronto's history, an era where local trade dominance, small-town nostalgia, and polite neighborly performances were allowed to buy an absolute exemption from the moral and legal laws of the universe. The final summary statements of the independent inquiry were scheduled for a Monday morning that brought a sudden, violent autumn storm to the city, with heavy sheets of gray rain lashing against the tall arched windows of the downtown facility, creating a natural, dimmed soundtrack that matched the dark gravity of the moment. The lead counsel stood before the panel not as an advocate seeking a political victory, but as a clinical narrator of a 40-year injustice, using a massive digital timeline that filled the entire wall behind the tables to show how every single day of the suspect's quiet life had been an active, calculated insult to the memory of the woman he had destroyed. He walked the panel through the high-tech genetic genealogy matches one last time, then connected them to the warehouse blueprints, the structural anomalies beneath the hydraulic lift, the municipal permit alterations, and the hidden basement journals, weaving these separate pieces of historical debris into an unassailable mountain of ironclad, scientific certainty. He demanded that the city finally strip the deceased predator's estate of its remaining financial assets, returning the neighborhood to a reality where the law applied equally to everyone, regardless of the trade overalls they wore or the community networks they commanded. When the legal representatives for the division stood for their final address, the argument felt entirely hollow, a repetitive recitation of administrative technicalities about historical storage regulations and primitive data management models that sounded completely insignificant against the reality of a life violently interrupted and a community systematically deceived for a generation. They tried one last time to invoke the image of the dedicated local craftsman, pointing to the charitable donations, the community center repairs, and the youth sports equipment that the suspect's repair shop had financed across East York since the 1980s. But the words fell flat in a room that was still echoing with the description of soundproof workspaces and shredded blueprints. The inquiry panel watched the lawyers with a blank, detached expression, their eyes fixed on the evidence binders as if they were counting down the final minutes of a grand illusion that had been maintained since December of 1986. When the panel finally retired to draft their ultimate recommendations to the Attorney General, the silence that returned to the facility was absolute, a heavy, expectant void that hung over the entire city as Toronto waited to see if the final report could truly balance a structural debt that had been compounding in the dark for over 40 years. The transition of the independent inquiry from the public hearing stage to closed-door executive deliberations did not offer a release of the psychological pressure anchoring the East York neighborhood. Instead, it ushered in a period of intense, volatile static that paralyzed the entire urban valley. Inside the secure rooms of the provincial judicial complex, the panel members sat alone with the physical and digital wreckage of a 40-year deception. The three-dimensional architectural scans of the subterranean storage bays, the altered municipal permits, the industrial sealant core samples, and the high-tech genetic genealogy charts that had pinpointed the deceased repairman. Outside, along the rain-slicked corridors of Main Street, the ordinary momentum of commerce ground to an absolute halt as storefront televisions remained tuned continuously to the live updates from the City Hall press gallery, and conversations at the local subway entrances were reduced to hushed, anxious debates about institutional accountability. Every hour that passed without a formal announcement from the Attorney General's office was interpreted by the public as a sign of deep, structural friction within the bureaucracy, a terrifying possibility that the suspect's deep-rooted community networks and the legal defense fund of his remaining estate were managing to dilute the severity of the final report. The agonizing wait ended not with a sudden press conference, but with the quiet, electronic publication of the inquiry's definitive findings on the provincial judicial database, an event that sent an immediate, visceral shockwave through the entire legal and political apparatus of the city. Within 20 minutes, the printed volumes were being dissected by legal analysts on every major television network, their voices carrying a heavy, solemn cadence as they read the panel's blistering conclusions regarding the 1986 investigation. The report did not use the polite, reassuring language of standard bureaucratic assessments. It delivered a devastating, clinical autopsy of a multi-decade administrative failure, stating on the record that the local division had operated with a complete lack of imagination and a dangerous level of social deference that effectively insulated the predator from the reach of the law. The victim's surviving classmates and neighbors gathered in spontaneous, quiet groups outside the East York Community Center, their faces pale under the flickering streetlights as they listened to the broadcast details of how their natural desire for small-town trust had been weaponized against them by a monster who lived just 3 streets away. The report's financial recommendations were swift, absolute, and completely devoid of the leniency the suspect's remaining family had fought for through their high-priced estate lawyers, with the presiding justice ordering a total freezing of all commercial assets linked to the historical repair shop matrix. The provincial authority initiated a massive asset forfeiture action designed to seize the multi-million-dollar real estate holdings and commercial trusts that the killer had built on the foundation of his local trade dominance, effectively routing those funds into a specialized permanent foundation dedicated to the investigation of Heartland cold cases. The image of the deceased billionaire's corporate name being aggressively stripped from the titles of local commercial properties felt like a necessary, structural execution of a manufactured legacy, a public declaration that the wealth accumulated during his 40 years of absolute anonymity was nothing more than an uncollected debt owed to the young woman he had destroyed in 1986. The suspect himself had escaped a maximum security prison cell by dying in a hospital bed, but the system was now ensuring that his family name would be permanently erased from the respectable commercial history of the province. The immediate structural consequence of the inquiry's report was the total, mandatory evacuation of the local division's historical record vault, as a team of provincial marshals and federal forensic archivists moved into the East York precinct to oversee the complete reorganization of the cold case department. Every unsolved file dating back to the late 20th century was pulled from the traditional metal cabinets and loaded into secure, climate-controlled vehicles to be transported to a centralized, state-of-the-art technological facility in downtown Toronto, where the local political networks could carry no influence over the data. Investigators discovered that the historical division leadership had consistently underfunded the precinct's microtrace storage systems, purposefully allowing older physical evidence to sit in damp, unmonitored baseline lockers while spending their municipal budgets on visible, high-profile patrol equipment that burnished their public relations image. The realization that their local tax dollars had been actively mismanaged to create a forensic blind spot was a profound, sickening revelation for the residents, forcing them to acknowledge that the apparent safety of their suburban enclave was a fragile illusion maintained by a system that preferred institutional comfort over absolute truth. At the site of the former Main Street repair shop, which had sat as a vacant, fenced-off gravel lot since the industrial wrecking crews demolished the brick facade, a quiet but deeply symbolic community gathering took place on a crisp autumn evening. The local transit authority, working in direct coordination with the Victims Foundation, unveiled a small, modern pocket park completely dedicated to the memory of the 19-year-old musician whose future had been stolen in the winter blizzard. The space was entirely devoid of commercial signage or historical references to the local merchants association that the suspect had once directed. It featured only a simple, polished granite bench surrounded by native Ontario birch trees and a modest bronze plaque that detailed the unyielding, high-tech science that had finally broken through 40 years of silence. The daughter of the victim stood before the small crowd, her posture resilient and completely free from the defensive caution that had defined her childhood, as she laid a single winter rose on the stone, looking up at the subway exit without the paralyzing weight of the unknown clawing at her heart for the first time in her conscious life. The psychological impact of the inquiry's final publication also triggered an immediate, internal purge within the executive boards of the regional charitable organizations and youth sports leagues that the suspect had financed during his rise to dominance in the 1990s. Civic leaders who had once proudly stood next to the repairman at public fundraisers, smiling for local newspaper photographers while holding oversized donation checks, found themselves subjected to intense, defensive audits by state regulators looking to determine if his philanthropy had been used to silence internal concerns or influence municipal appointments. The local hockey arena, which featured a prominent bronze dedication plaque celebrating the suspect's corporate sponsorship of the youth divisions, saw the marker chiseled out of the concrete wall over a single evening, leaving a rough, jagged void in the entryway that mirrored the internal desolation of the community's shattered trust. The town was learning that the predator's charity was not an act of civic generosity, but a cold, deliberate layer of camouflage engineered to buy the absolute blindness of the parents whose children he was smiling at every weekend. While the community wrestled with its historical guilt, the high-tech forensic pathology laboratories that had initiated the genetic genealogy breakthrough continued their automated, algorithmic analysis of the biological trace arrays recovered from the suspect's private storage lockers. The technicians were operating with the hushed, military precision of scientists working inside a biocontainment grid, treating the deceased killer's verified DNA sequence as a genetic prism through which dozens of other unresolved coastal and suburban cold cases could be viewed. They utilized advanced, high-resolution mass spectrometry to analyze the chemical composition of the vintage tools and custom welding equipment that had been preserved in his hidden floor safe, discovering that several items carried microscopic, degraded trace matrices that did not match the 1986 victim. This data was immediately injected into the National Violent Criminal Tracking Database, generating a series of potential algorithmic links to unresolved missing person files from across 3 neighboring provinces, a chilling indication that the East York repair shop had functioned as the logistical nexus for a much wider, multi-jurisdictional career of serial predation that the pre-digital era had been entirely incapable of detecting. The defense lawyers who had managed the suspect's estate during the public hearings retreated entirely from the media spotlight, their confident assertions of cross-contamination and data privacy violations completely silenced by the unassailable, mechanical precision of the inquiry's engineering reports. They rushed past the remaining cameras at the courthouse steps with their briefcases clutched to their chests, refusing to issue statements to the true crime bloggers or the mainstream networks, their high-priced legal campaign completely deflated by the total collapse of their client's public reputation. The family members of the deceased killer chose to sell their remaining residential properties in East York and leave the province under assumed corporate identities, unable to endure the cold, judgmental silence that greeted them whenever they stepped onto the local sidewalks, their family name having turned into a permanent, historical synonym for absolute deception and unpunished horror. As the winter winds began to return to Toronto, blowing a fresh layer of gray, freezing slush across the concrete lanes of Main Street, the local government held its first regular session since the publication of the Independent Inquiry, an event that felt more like a solemn administrative funeral than a return to standard municipal operations. The seats where the Historical Council supervisors had sat during the 1980s and 90s were occupied by a temporary panel of state-appointed administrators whose flat, clinical voices read listless technical reports regarding the complete restructuring of the county's zoning and procurement laws. The public gallery was entirely empty. The citizens of East York did not show up to demand changes or voice their anger, their total absence a crushing declaration of psychological saturation, a collective recognition that the historical rot within their local governance had run so deep that participation felt like a grotesque validation of a structural lie. The community had lost its civic pride, its traditional heartland identity replaced by a hard, protective survivalism that forced every household to lock their deadbolts early and turn off their porch lights, determined to live their daily lives entirely outside the shadow of an archive that had betrayed them for 40 years. The true legacy of the Toronto cold case was ultimately not a story of a system working seamlessly to correct its own historical errors, but a terrifying, multi-layered autopsy of how easily a small, decent neighborhood can be hollowed out from the inside by a predator who understands the social currency of public honor and manual trade dominance. The 1986 folder was closed. The red stamp in the municipal basement archive was dry. The repair shop was a pocket park of native birch trees, and the killer was an unindexed entry in a cemetery ledger. But the internal character of East York had been permanently altered by the realization that their decades of peace were a manufactured illusion, a product of a continuous, calculated performance that had walked among them unrecognized for a generation. The community had used the unassailable power of 21st century forensic science to trace the genetic path of the monster directly to his deathbed, but they had paid for that truth with the very fabric of their multi-generational security, leaving behind an urban landscape that would move into the future with a permanent, defensive vigilance. A collective awareness that the wolves who hunt the innocent do not wait on the edges of the dark, but walk down the center aisle of the front row, wearing the dusty overalls of local trade or the tailored suits of public office, smiling at your families, and writing the very laws that are meant to keep the dark from breaking through. The departure of the Independent Inquiry's investigative teams did not signal a clean return to the quiet, multi-generational complacency that had defined the streets of East York since the mid-20th century. Instead, it ushered in a bleak, permanent autumn of the mind, a period of profound cultural hibernation where the community was forced to live entirely alone with the structural ruins of its own history. The harsh winter winds sweeping off Lake Ontario, which had once been viewed by the local families as a predictable, comforting element of their Midwestern rhythm, now carried a sharp, metallic edge of psychological terror. Relentless reminder of that December night in 1986 when the swirling snow became a perfect chemical eraser for an absolute horror. Along the commercial corridors of Main Street, the flickering neon signs of the local hardware shops and family bakeries cast long, defensive shadows across the sidewalks, illuminating the very paths where a serial predator had navigated for 40 years with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a trusted neighborhood craftsman. Inside the brick offices of the municipal administration, the silence was thick and suffocating as the remaining civil clerks moved through the corridors like ghosts, avoiding eye contact and speaking only in the flat, clinical shorthand of people who knew their entire professional lineage was being treated as a secondary crime scene by federal receivers. This systematic exposure of a 40-year deception initiated a profound, generational paralysis that deeply infected the town's younger residents, who had grown up watching the repairman receive civic awards, direct youth leagues, and deliver speeches about the traditional values of hard work and neighborhood loyalty at local high school fundraisers. The sudden, high-tech realization that their community's moral anchor was an entirely artificial performance, a meticulously curated mask designed to conceal a soundproof subterranean chamber of horrors, tore down the natural, innocent respect for authority that holds a small town together, replacing it with a hard, cynical detachment that could not be repaired by a simple courthouse press release. Teenagers and young adults looked at the local police department with an open, defensive suspicion, wondering how many of the historical division captains had consciously buried tips, ignored anomalies in the commercial registries, or altered local patrol logs to protect the precinct's relationship with a prominent merchant who welded their security gates for free. The local library's archive of historical community newspapers from the winter of 1987, which featured full-page spreads celebrating the suspect's corporate charity drives, became an object of quiet revulsion, its microfilm reels handled with the same clinical terror one might reserve for a biohazard exhibit. A physical proof of how deeply the predator's legacy had been woven into the milestones of their childhoods. The state's specialized forensic task force, operating out of an anonymous, high-security facility miles from the Toronto city limits to ensure total insulation from the regional political networks, continued its relentless post-conviction audit, pulling thousands of historical commercial deeds, equipment permits, and municipal zoning variances from the municipal vault. They discovered a highly disturbing pattern of structural manipulation from the late 1980s where the repairman had systematically used dummy corporate names and offshore real estate syndicates to acquire isolated warehouse parcels bordering the East York Ravine lines immediately following major spikes in regional prowler reports. The digital maps compiled by the modern investigators revealed that every single one of these commercial acquisitions had occurred within a 6-week window of a major breakthrough in the 1986 cold case inquiry, demonstrating that whenever the police department of the era had gotten close to checking the valley perimeters, the tradesmen had simply purchased the dirt, installed heavy steel access barriers, and designated the territory as a private security zone. This wasn't just a criminal evading a standard transit patrol. It was a methodical engineer utilizing the real estate and corporate machinery of the province to ensure that his private hunting grounds would remain permanently off-limits to civilian eyes and modern environmental scouts. As the financial auditors dug deeper into the commercial ledgers of the suspect's estate, a darker pattern of administrative sterilization emerged from the lines of data, a deliberate, multi-decade campaign to ensure that the local police force remained technically and structurally incapable of analyzing the biological residue of his youth. The repairman had consistently used his position on regional civic and business improvement committees to lobby aggressively against upgrading the county's long-term evidence storage facilities, purposefully directing public development funds toward highly visible infrastructure projects like streetscape beautification, while allowing the precinct's basement lockers to suffer from chronic structural neglect. He had argued on the public record that the division should prioritize traditional, face-to-face investigative policing over investing taxpayer dollars in the speculative, high-cost fantasy of early DNA profiling technology, a political stance that had been widely praised by local tax watchdog groups at the time as a masterclass in fiscal discipline. The reality was a terrifying exercise in criminal foresight. The predator was using his immense social influence to systematically blind the state's future forensic capabilities, ensuring that if science ever evolved to the point of reading the biological trace arrays snagged on that porch railing, the infrastructure to process it would be so disorganized that the evidence would rot in the dark before it could ever reach a laboratory sequencer. While the state troopers tore through the corporate paper trails, the psychological isolation of the deceased killer's surviving family members turned into a permanent, domestic siege inside their large detached home on the edge of the affluent suburbs. His wife, who had spent decades as a respected figure of the local merchant elite, organizing neighborhood charity galas and hosting seasonal dinners for municipal council members, had completely vanished from the public eye, her daily necessities delivered by private security couriers and her perimeter fences reinforced with modern infrared cameras to keep looky-loose away. The community's old sympathy for her, the initial assumption that she was an innocent victim of a horrific double life, had curdled into a cold, judgmental distance as leaks from the grand jury indicated that her hours of closed-door testimony had revealed a history of matching inconsistencies she had actively chosen to ignore to preserve her social status. The town could not forgive the fact that she had lived a life of extraordinary comfort funded by the corporate operations of a killer, that she had shared a bed just miles from the subway platform where the student had been taken, and that she had chosen to view her husband's late-night absences through the protective, comfortable lens of corporate emergency work rather than the demanding eyes of basic human decency. The local tourism and real estate economy, heavily dependent on the historic charm and premium lifestyle partnerships the billionaire tradesman had brokered through his private investment funds, began to experience a slow, structural collapse as international brands scrambled to dissolve their relationships with East York. Major commercial development projects that had been scheduled to break ground along the ravines were suddenly canceled or relocated to other provinces, leaving empty, cleared fields of topsoil along the secondary highways that looked like physical scars on the landscape, matching the internal desolation of the town itself. The regional credit union, where the suspect had served as a primary shareholder and board advisor since 1989, was placed under immediate federal oversight after auditors uncovered an intricate network of low-interest personal loans extended to historical county supervisors. Loans that carried no formal repayment schedules but aligned perfectly with votes on zoning boards that favored the officials' commercial projects. The residents were learning through the brutal reality of frozen equity accounts and tanking property values that their clean water lines, their paved storefront boardwalks, and their economic stability were the literal byproducts of a deal made with a monster, a collective bribe paid to an entire population to keep them from asking what happened in the blizzard of 1986. Deep within the monochrome, hyper-secure environment of the Kingston Penitentiary System, the files relating to the suspect's final hours were locked away in an administrative archive, a clinical end to a life that had successfully cheated the living jurisdiction of the court. Though the billionaire repairman had escaped a permanent cell by drawing his last breath on a hospital bed, the State Behavioral Analysis Unit continued to treat his recorded deathbed confession as a master blueprint of a highly evolved, dual-identity sociopath. Teams of psychological profiles sat in windowless rooms listening to the raspy, low audio logs captured by the bedside recorder, parsing every cold, unrepentant syllable to understand how an individual could spend 40 years maintaining a flawless public performance while keeping his true identity completely uncoupled from the moral laws of society. The data showed that throughout the multi-hour statement, whenever the suspect described the specific mechanics of his surveillance over the victim, his voice carried no traces of fear or remorse. It maintained the flat, rhythmic precision of a mechanic describing the replacement of a worn engine part, a chilling proof that to his very last moment on Earth, he viewed his victims not as human beings with futures, but as structural logistical problems to be solved and managed. Back in the town, the forensic geneticists who had cracked the cold case were invited by the Regional Law Enforcement Academy to deliver a closed-door lecture on the methodology of the high-tech breakthrough, a presentation that was treated by the older detectives as a formal funeral for the traditional world of criminal investigation. The scientists stood before the row of silent, uniformed officers and demonstrated how the genetic genealogy algorithm had bypassed every single corrupted land record, every dropped lead, and every piece of multi-million-dollar political intimidation by simply tracing the immutable biological markers left behind on that rough wood porch railing. They explained that in the modern era of automated DNA sequencing, a predator no longer had the luxury of outsmarting the local sheriff or buying the silence of a county board. Their own family tree had become an automated, global surveillance network that would eventually track them down through the saliva samples of distant relatives they had never met. The lecture was a clinical demonstration of absolute inevitability, a proof that the passage of time, once a criminal's greatest ally, had been converted by science into a relentless, compounding trap that would eventually pull every historical horror out of the dark and into the blinding glare of a modern courtroom. The physical site of the original disappearance, the quiet, narrow street corner just outside the East York subway exit, had become a dark landmark for true crime tourists who drove through the neighborhood on weekends, their slow-moving vehicles and flashing cameras infuriating the local business owners who wanted the history of the block to be forgotten. The sidewalk had been entirely repaired. The old lighting fixtures where the shadows had lengthened in 1986 were replaced by modern high-intensity LEDs, and the surrounding buildings were filled with trendy retail shops. But the structural memory of that freezing December night could not be renovated out of the neighborhood's consciousness. Neighbors who had lived on the avenue for 40 years still found themselves staring at the asphalt whenever a winter storm began to blow off the lake, their minds instantly replaying the image of the flashing emergency lights from their youth and the cold, terrifying realization that the polite, helpful repairman who had stood with them on the curb offering condolences was the one who had carried the girl into the dark. The street had become a psychological monument to their own collective failure, a permanent reminder of how easily they had allowed themselves to be comforted by the polite words of an insider while the monster was standing right in front of them. As the winter snow began to fall over Toronto once again, covering the ravines and the empty gravel lots in a uniform, silent layer of white, the East York Municipal Council held its first public session since the publication of the Independent Inquiry, an event that was meant to signal a new beginning but felt more like a memorial service for a ruined institution. The chairs where the Historical Council supervisors had sat during the 1980s and 90s were occupied by a temporary panel of state-appointed administrators whose flat, clinical voices read listless technical reports regarding the complete restructuring of the county's zoning and procurement laws. The public gallery was entirely empty. The citizens of the town did not show up to demand changes or voice their anger. Their total absence, a crushing declaration of psychological saturation, a collective recognition that the historical rot within their local governance had run so deep that participation felt like a grotesque validation of a structural lie. The community had lost its civic pride, its traditional heartland identity replaced by a hard, protective survivalism that forced every household to lock their deadbolts early and turn off their porch lights, determined to live their daily lives entirely outside the shadow of an archive that had betrayed them for 40 years. The true legacy of the Toronto cold case was ultimately not a story of a system working seamlessly to correct its own historical errors, but a terrifying, multi-layered autopsy of how easily a small, decent neighborhood can be hollowed out from the inside by a predator who understands the social currency of public honor and manual trade dominance. The 1986 folder was closed. The red stamp in the municipal basement archive was dry. The repair shop was a pocket park of native birch trees, and the killer was an unindexed entry in a cemetery ledger. But the internal character of East York had been permanently altered by the realization that their decades of peace were a manufactured illusion, a product of a continuous, calculated performance that had walked among them unrecognized for a generation. The community had used the unassailable power of 21st century forensic science to trace the genetic path of the monster directly to his deathbed, but they had paid for that truth with the very fabric of their multi-generational security, leaving behind an urban landscape that would move into the future with a permanent, defensive vigilance. A collective awareness that the wolves who hunt the innocent do not wait on the edges of the dark, but walk down the center aisle of the front row. Wearing the dusty overalls of local trade or the tailored suits of public office, smiling at your families, and writing the very laws that are meant to keep the dark from breaking through. The breaking of the early spring thaw along the Don Valley and across the expanding residential blocks of East York did not dilute the toxic, silent architecture of suspicion that had gripped Toronto since the publication of the repairman's deathbed confession. As the thick, gray ice sheets finally cracked and receded from the edges of the urban ravines, they did not reveal a clean slate. Instead, the melting snow exposed the raw, jagged contours of a neighborhood that had spent 40 years sleeping under a beautifully orchestrated illusion. The multi-acre commercial lot where the suspect's Main Street repair shop had stood for 4 decades was no longer a bustling hub of local blue-collar commerce. It sat as a grotesque, fenced-off crater of raw gravel, mud, and bright yellow police line tape that whipped frantically against the skeleton branches of the birch trees whenever the freezing wind swept off Lake Ontario. This wasn't just an empty piece of metropolitan real estate. It was a physical manifestation of a 40-year-old cold case that refused to be neatly summarized or filed away into the archives, a terrain stripped of its industrial normalcy to reveal the dark, subterranean reality that had been nurtured beneath its concrete floors since the winter of 1986. Inside the central precinct of Division 54, the atmosphere had transitioned into a phase of permanent, structural exhaustion that no modern public relations campaign or internal management shakeup could truly correct. The temporary provincial investigators and state auditors who had occupied the station following the initial genetic genealogy breakthrough had finally packed up their digital processing units, leaving behind a newly installed administration of outside law enforcement professionals who moved through the bullpen with a cold, clinical neutrality that deeply alienated the remaining old guard deputies. These new leaders possessed no multi-generational ties to the local merchants, no connection to the families who had built the suburban economy, and absolute zero patience for the defensive, insular culture of a precinct that had allowed a serial predator to operate unmonitored within its territory for a generation. They installed high-resolution biometric logging pads at every secure entrance, integrated automated, blockchain-secure chain-of-custody tracking systems across all evidence lockers, and replaced the weathered oak desks with sterile, gray modular workstations that felt completely stripped of human history. The department was being aggressively sanitized, dragged into the modern era by an influx of provincial capital and cold bureaucracy, but beneath the slick, efficient surface of the new regime, the older desk sergeants could still feel the crushing, static pressure of the historical failure that had forever compromised their badge, a knowledge that the man who had welded their security gates and attended their retirement dinners had been using their uniform as a psychological shield to protect his private burial pits. This pervasive sense of institutional degradation was mirrored in the executive boardrooms of the regional credit unions and mortgage syndicates that line the urban valleys, which were now undergoing a devastating secondary wave of public exposure as bankruptcy courts began the painful process of liquidating the officials' multi-million-dollar corporate network. The elegant, brick-fronted financial buildings on Main Street, where the repairman's private holding companies had held dominant economic sway for over 40 years, saw their historic insignias aggressively sandblasted from the masonry over a single weekend, replaced by the generic, pixelated logos of national conglomerates that had purchased the distressed assets for pennies on the dollar. Local independent contractors, family-owned hardware suppliers, and small business owners who had relied on the suspects' private financing to bankroll their commercial expansions found themselves suddenly caught in a tightening vice of high-interest corporate debt, their personal financial stability completely shattered by their proximity to the fallen mogul's money laundering machine. The community was learning, through the brutal mechanics of federal foreclosure notices and public asset auctions on the steps of City Hall, that their decades of unparalleled suburban prosperity had been directly subsidized by the silence of a monster, that the luxury commercial boom of the late 20th century was merely a glittering, structural bribe paid to ensure the public would never look too closely at the darkness festering in the local trade associations. As the corporate liquidators tore through the physical and digital records of the official's estate, they were forced to confront the absolute, terrifying scale of his private domestic surveillance apparatus, a system of control that extended far beyond his professional real estate power into the private homes of his inner circle. In a hidden sub-basement of his oceanfront residence, behind a reinforced steel vault door that required an encrypted digital key to bypass, state forensic technicians discovered a massive wall of high-definition servers and magnetic recording arrays that were wired directly into the telecommunication backbones of the county administration building, the regional zoning offices, and the private lines of several high-ranking municipal supervisors. The audio logs, which dated back to the early winter of 1985, revealed that the predator had been systematically blackmailing his own business partners, his political allies, and his administrative staff, utilizing illegally intercepted conversations about financial irregularities, extramarital affairs, and small-town corporate scandals to ensure that no one within the local government would ever have the leverage or the courage to question his late-night movements or his unusual influence over the police archives. The town was forced to look at a reality that was far more complex and insidious than a single act of spontaneous violence in 1982. They were looking at a carefully engineered, localized autocracy where the survival of an entire socioeconomic class had been dependent on their willingness to protect the secrets of an apex predator who held the keys to their public and private ruin. The public exposure of this blackmail matrix effectively destroyed the remaining social cohesion of Ventura's luxury developments, turning old friends into bitter, paranoid adversaries who spent their evenings reviewing 40 years of political favors, neighborhood gossip, and country club partnerships to calculate who had known about the tapes and who had actively participated in the suppression of the truth to safeguard their own reputations. The exclusive yacht clubs and golf resorts, which had once been the premier venues for the region's elite to host high society fundraisers and political galas under the officials' direct corporate sponsorship, saw their private memberships plummet within weeks as residents refused to sit in the same dining rooms with individuals whose names had been discovered on the black box recordings. The neighborhood culture of affluent beachside gatherings was entirely replaced by a defensive, locked-door isolationism where families remained behind their high-security gates, their televisions tuned continuously to the live state legal feeds, their minds consumed by the terrifying knowledge that the polite, wealthy grandfather who had helped finance their local schools and charitable clinics had been using that very same philanthropy to purchase their absolute, unconscious complicity in his crime. While the community turned inward, eating itself alive with suspicion and historical guilt, the state prosecution team began the complex, high-stakes preparation for a massive federal civil rights trial that would target the county government itself. an institutional lawsuit designed to establish absolute legal accountability for the decades of administrative obstruction that had kept the 1982 cold case from being resolved in the pre-digital era. The state attorneys flooded the local media with official subpoena notices for current and former city council members, forcing ordinary civil servants to hire expensive defense lawyers from Los Angeles and Sacramento to protect themselves from being dragged into a federal conspiracy indictment that could result in significant prison sentences and the total forfeiture of their public pensions. The courtroom in the state capitol became a theater for the clinical autopsy of small-town political corruption, with prosecutors demonstrating through a mountain of internal memos, unrecorded budget allocations, and sudden changes in police leadership that the county administration had operated as a protective cocoon for the billionaire, prioritizing the preservation of their institutional image over the constitutional rights of the young college student who had been erased from the world. Deep within the monochrome, high-security environment of the Pelican Bay State Penitentiary, the official had adjusted to the permanent, mechanical rhythm of his condemnation with the cold, calculated stoicism of a man who still believed that his total silence was a form of personal victory over the system that had stripped him of his name. He refused to grant interviews to the true crime authors and investigative biographers who wrote him daily letters offering millions of dollars for a definitive, narrated confession. His incoming mail was strictly restricted to a single legal pad from his appellate team, and his daily human contact was limited to the flat, monosyllabic commands of the correctional officers who monitored his movements through the reinforced steel mesh of his cell block. He spent his single hour of mandatory daily recreation walking in small, tight circles around the asphalt yard of the administrative segregation unit, his eyes fixed firmly on the concrete wall above him, his posture maintaining a ghostly, rigid mimicry of the corporate authority he had once wielded over the county. He understood, with the terrifying clarity of a pure sociopath, that as long as he refused to give the state the location of the physical remnants or explain the exact mechanics of his 1982 movements, he maintained an absolute, untouchable domain over the final chapter of the tragedy, a silent declaration that though the state had claimed his freedom, his malice remained a private, sovereign state that no forensic algorithm or genetic sequence could ever truly conquer. Back in the changing topography of the valley, the forensic geneticists who had ignited the initial breakthrough announced the creation of a permanent regional archive dedicated exclusively to the cold cases of the Pacific coastline, an initiative that was funded by a massive grant from the Victims Foundation and designed to ensure that no wealthy developer or small-town politician could ever again use their local influence to freeze a criminal investigation. The laboratory, located in a neutral, modern industrial park miles from the county lines, became a focal point for families from across 3 states who had spent decades living in the same agonizing vacuum of uncertainty that had once defined the young student's roommate, their arms filled with old police files, faded missing person posters, and cardboard boxes of clothing that had been preserved in attics and basements since the 70s and 80s. The scientists moved through these historical relics with a calm, military precision, extracting the microscopic biological ghosts of long-dead predators from the weathered fibers of the past, converting the raw, chaotic tragedies of the coastline into clean, unassailable digital sequences that were immediately uploaded into the global tracking network. The lab had effectively converted the 1982 breakthrough into a continuous, automated engine of historical accountability, a technological hammer that hung over every aging criminal who had relied on the ignorance of the pre-digital era to protect their comfortable, modern retirements. The actual site of the official's former suburban real estate headquarters, which had sat abandoned and guarded by state troopers since the day of the sentencing, was eventually purchased by a regional land trust at a public tax auction and slated for complete ecological restoration, a process that many residents viewed as a necessary, structural exorcism of the physical environment that had nurtured his double life. A crew of heavy demolition contractors arrived on a crisp April morning, their massive excavators and hydraulic rams making short work of the grand pillars, the vaulted ceilings, and the reinforced basement walls that had once held the politician's illegal surveillance matrix, reducing the symbol of his local dominance to a mountain of shattered brick, concrete dust, and broken glass that was immediately hauled away in a convoy of industrial dump trucks. The swimming pool was filled with crushed stone, The perfectly manicured hedges that had blocked the view of the paparazzi were ripped out by their roots, and the entire multi-acre lot was graded down to the raw topsoil, planted with native California prairie grasses and wildflowers that would eventually grow to look like the natural, untamed landscape that had existed before the first luxury developments were carved out of the coastal cliffs. It was a complete, structural erasure of his presence from the neighborhood, a physical declaration by the community that some histories are too toxic to be preserved in the architecture of their daily lives, leaving behind an anonymous, open field that would offer no comfort and no memory to the passing generation. As the late spring rain began to fall over the region, turning the newly planted prairie into a vibrant, deep green carpet that shimmered under the gray Midwestern sky, the town's remaining civic leaders gathered in the renovated council chambers for the formal presentation of the new county charter, a document that was designed by state legal experts to permanently dismantle the concentration of executive power that the official had exploited for 30 years. The atmosphere in the room was flat, formal, and heavy with a lingering, protective caution. The public gallery was partially filled with younger residents who watched the proceedings with a hard, unblinking vigilance, their presence a silent reminder to the politicians that the old era of blind trust and backroom deals was permanently dead. There were no grand speeches about the virtues of heartland community life, no ribbon-cutting showmanship, and no celebratory applause when the new charter was signed into law. The politicians simply moved through the line-item adjustments with the quiet, listless precision of clerks completing a necessary, administrative chore, their voices carrying the flat, humble tone of people who knew their titles had been forever compromised by the actions of the man who had preceded them. The true legacy of the California cold case was ultimately not a story of a system working to correct its own errors, but a chilling, multi-layered autopsy of how easily a wealthy community can be hollowed out from the inside by a predator who understands the social currency of public honor and financial charity. The 1982 folder was closed. The red stamp in the municipal basement was dry. The cabin was a patch of briars, and the mansion was an anonymous field of wildflowers. But the internal character of the town had been permanently altered by the realization that their peace was a manufactured illusion, a product of a continuous, decades-long cover-up that had infected their churches, their schools, their banks, and their homes. The community had used the unassailable power of modern forensic science to tear away the official's mask and watched him be led away to a concrete cell where he would eventually turn into dust. But they had paid for that truth with the very fabric of their security, leaving behind a heartland landscape that would move into the future with a permanent, defensive limp. A collective awareness that the wolves who hunt the innocent do not wait on the edges of the dark, but walk down the center aisle of the front row, wearing the tailored suits of public office, smiling at your families, and directing the very laws that are meant to keep the dark from breaking through.